a vanished veil, a secret bride, and a mystery waiting to be solved. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Tell me in the comments where you're joining from. I always treasure hearing from you. Let's begin. It is an odd thing how the ordinary contrivances of civilization, windows, mirrors, the polished face of a decanter, may conspire with malice to produce an impression more uncanny than a séance. Of all the singular affairs in which I have had the honor to attend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, none began with so simple an instrument, nor with so confounding an assertion, as that which Inspector Lestrade carried up our 17 steps one rain-glossed evening of late November. The fog had not yet descended in its worst yellow opacity, but the streets were wet, the lamps blunted by a mist that turned them into mothballs of light, and cabs went past Baker Street with that muffled hiss of wheels upon damp macadam, which makes one feel more keenly the necessity of hearth and fire. Holmes had been amusing himself with his violin. I use the word with restraint, for the thing he drew from that worn instrument was not mirth, but the dusky, supple kind of melody which seems to invent a private chamber of silence around its hearer. He had only just laid it aside for the Persian slipper when Mrs. Hudson introduced our visitor. Lestrade came in with his hat under his arm, and the rain gathered upon his whiskers, and gave us that curt nod with which he is accustomed to acknowledge his debts to Providence, and to Holmes in the same motion. He placed a folded newspaper upon our table, took the seat Holmes indicated, and after a brief, professional clearing of the throat, delivered his disconcerting sentence. "We have a gentleman dead in Montague Street, Dr. Watson," said he, "and a witness ready to swear that at the very moment of the crime he saw in the study window, not the gentleman at his desk, as any natural man would expect, but another man entirely." Holmes steepled his fingers and regarded Lestrade with an expression which might pass for indifference to the unpracticed eye. To me it meant that some inner mechanism had caught and engaged. "Another man, Lestrade," said he. "Do you imply an apparition, or do you bring me a matter for the Criminal Investigation Department?" "A matter for both, if you please," returned Lestrade with the shadow of a smile. "The dead man is Mr. Leonard Barclay, retired East India merchant, a highly respectable personage. His study looks upon the rear garden. The window is a French affair opening inward, with plate-glass panes recently fitted at a cost I cannot comprehend. The door was locked on the inside, the key in the lock. When the servants, alarmed by the gardener's cries, forced it with a coal-axe, they found Barclay face down beside his escritoire, with a bruise at the temple, and not a soul else within. But the gardener is adamant. Before the household took fright, he had looked up at that very window and seen a man he swears was not his master." Holmes leaned forward a fraction. "Describe this gardener. Name of Cribb, ex-sapper, 50 if a day. Sober H Division would call him reliable. He was staking a canvas over the cold frame to keep the frost from the cucumber seedlings. The study is on the ground floor rear aspect. He glanced up because he heard the rattle of the sash catch, so he says, and observed, well, as I tell you, a face he calls unfamiliar. He is ready to make oath that the man he saw had a longer nose, darker hair, and wore the collar points outside his neckcloth, which Mr. Barclay never did. He says the stranger's left hand, held a paper, and he bent as if to read by the lamp." Holmes's eyes had narrowed upon the word left. He flicked a look toward me, and then to the newspaper Lestrade had brought. "And this?" said he. "Evening Standard," Lestrade replied. "A column and a half already. They love a locked room and a respectable corpse. The plate-glass window is mentioned, you see. Also the street. Montague Street. You will have heard of Barclay in connection with the philanthropic fund for sailors' widows." "I have," said Holmes, who had read everything, forgotten nothing, and corrected the encyclopedia on points of Turkish tobacco. The bruise. "A single contusion to the right temple. The surgeon puts it down to a blow with the corner of something, statuette, paperweight, what have you. No fracture. There is a carpet, so little blood. Death, in the surgeon's opinion, as much from the shock as from the blow. There was a shattered inkpot on the floor, spilt across a sheaf of correspondence. The desk is otherwise orderly. No sign of entry from the garden, the French windows latched within, and the door, as I have said, locked on the inside." "It is tidy enough to suit even Mr. Holmes." Lestrade's tone, which had begun in defiance, ended with involuntary admiration. Holmes raised his lids slowly. "Your stranger in the window," he murmured. A reflection, a shadow, or a deliberate contrivance? Describe the window's glass. New 2 weeks ago. Mr. Barclay had his study refitted. Fresh drapes, a Brussels carpet, and that glass responsible for a bill which made his housekeeper pale. Belgian plate glass, the glazier says. No joints, very bright, very true. The gardener insists he saw through it, not upon it. And at what hour? 6:30. Dusk enough for the lamps to be lit, but not yet full dark. Ah, said Holmes, with the tone of a man who lays a card face down and taps it. What of the household? A housekeeper of 30 years, Mrs. Eugenia Hollis, a maid, the aforementioned gardener, and a valet, one Edwin Grieve, recently taken on. Mr. Barclay was a widower. No children, no visitors announced to the servants that day. Holmes rose and, with that quick decision which is the outward sign of an inward chain ratcheting into place, took down his overcoat. I do not much affect Belgian glass, Lestrade, he said, but I confess to a taste for Montague Street in a drizzle. It lends character to the flagstones. He glanced at me with a light in his eye. Watson, your hat. We shall take a cab. It was a short drive through streets that made a grey chessboard of reflections, the horses steaming gently as if they carried some private grief each, and in due course we came to a sober house of brick, its fanlight dim, its windows squared and respectable, in that Georgian way which gives every pane an expression of propriety. A constable stood at the railings. Lestrade presented us, and we were admitted to a hall that smelt of beeswax coal, and the faint brackish hint one sometimes notices in the homes of gentlemen who have made their fortunes upon the sea. Mrs. Hollis met us near the stairs. She was a woman whose face had been ironed by habit into lines of service. Yet I observed the red rims of the eyes and the tightness at the mouth which told of more than mere household disarray. I am sorry for your loss, madam, said Holmes in a voice softer than one would expect from so dry a frame. We shall endeavour to discompose you as little as may be. If you please, Mr. Barclay's study. She led us down the passage to the rear, where the garden lay like a black rectangle beyond the glass, and admitted us to a room which declared in all its contents the travelled merchant and orderly mind. There were models of ships in glass cases, small as a man's forearm and rigged with an obsessiveness which I could not help admiring. There were oriental curiosities, a carved narwhal tusk, an ivory die that I would willingly have wagered was not ivory at all, and a mahogany escritoire, whose green leather top was blemished by an ink stain like a map of some uncharted country. Holmes did not approach the body at once. He went first to the French windows, glanced at the latch and then at the long bright sheet of glass which the rain beyond made darker and more absolute. He stood so that his profile and the lamp behind him might cast themselves upon the pane if the laws of optics indulged him, and then, with a brisk motion, knelt to inspect the sill. I saw him pinch between finger and thumb a trace of something dark, a smear too slight to be soot, and hold it to his nose. He touched the inner face of the glass very lightly, with the back of his knuckle as though to feel its temper. He examined the floor immediately before the window. The carpet pile was minutely disturbed in an arc, such as a chair might make if dragged a half-inch and returned. He noted, too, a pale crescent upon the rug, a duller shade in the light, no larger than a crown piece. Lestrade, said he at last, still kneeling, did anyone besides the servants and the police enter this room from the time the door was broken open? No one, Mr. Holmes. Holmes nodded and rose. He went then to the escritoire. Mr. Barclay lay a little to the right of it, as if he had fallen in making an impatient turn. The right temple showed the livid rise of the contusion. The hair clotted a little. His hand, the right, was open, palm up, as of a man who has relinquished an argument with a force that can neither be persuaded nor bribed. The left rested beneath him. On the leather writing surface, the reply drafts to several letters were set out with the method of a man who runs his day as a ship, by lists and times. The shattered inkpot had bled itself upon a folded sheet, which the police had prudently left untouched. Holmes bent, glanced, did not read. He had already seen what he wanted. He moved to the mantel. There was upon it a collection of paperweights, a malachite sphere, a wedge of glass with an etched vessel, and a small figure in bronze of Neptune with a trident no thicker than a match. Mrs. Hollis, said he, without looking round. How long since these windows were refitted? A fortnight, sir. she replied from the threshold, carefully not seeing the body. Mr. Barclay said the old panes made the room gloomy. They were dreadful draughts in winter, he said. He would have the best glass. And he had the best, murmured Holmes. He turned to the gardener, a stocky man in his working coat who had been drawn in and stood guilty, as if the affair were his fault for having eyes. Mr. Cribb, you have been put to some trouble by your honesty. I am obliged to you. Be so good as to stand where you were when you saw what you saw. Cribb shuffled to the strip of oilcloth by the French windows and, with a soldier's readiness to obey even strange orders, stepped out by the side door and down to the garden path. Holmes watched him through the glass, his face expressionless, then raised a hand. Cribb looked up, as one does when a man within a room makes the universal signal for attention, and pointed with an awkward shamefacedness to the spot. There, sir. There I looked. There I saw him. Holmes nodded, and his gaze slipped from the man to the pane itself. He stooped again, drew from his pocket lining that battered lens which has written more quiet tragedies than any pistol in Europe, and studied at the level of the latch a pair of faint abrasions hardly to be called scratches. Belgian plate glass, he said absently. A truthful servant. An untruthful window. Lestrade made a noise deep in his throat which could have been skepticism or admiration, but he held his tongue. Holmes turned to the door. One thing more, said he. The valet. Where is Mr. Edwin Grieve? In the pantry under watch, Lestrade answered. He is much put out. He says Mr. Barclay would not permit him after 6 o'clock on account of the gentleman's wish to work alone. Quite so, said Holmes. We must respect the habits of the dead and the truthfulness of glass, and of men who look into it at dusk. He took up his hat again, then paused, studying once more the dull crescent in the carpet by the window, as if he weighed it in his mind. Lestrade, have the kindness to allow no one to touch the latch, the sill, or, and here he indicated with his stick the little pale arc, this modest moon upon the rug, until tomorrow morning, when the light will be less of an accomplice. With that he turned to me, and in his eye there was the quiet excitement I had learned to read as the foreshadowing of late nights and very early mornings. I confess my own pulse quickened. The study held its breath, the rain traced its runes upon the glass, and beyond the pane the garden kept its counsel. We left the room as we had found it, save that the air now contained the faintest suggestion, not of Belgian glass, nor of rain, but of a mystery arranging itself piece by piece. Upon the table of my friend's inexorable mind, we did not leave at once, for Holmes had that nervous energy which, once engaged, asks to be fed with answers, even while it waits upon daylight. He turned back in the passage and requested Lestrade to indulge him with a brief word with the valet. We were shown to a scullery off the kitchen, where a thin, dark young fellow sat on a stool between two constables. He had that washed look one sees upon clerks surprised by disaster, yet there was something alert beneath the pallor, as of a man not yet resigned to the posture of the accused. "Your name is Edwin Grieve," said Holmes mildly, "and you were taken on 8 weeks since. Her gentleman's valet does not at first carry the jacket so, unless he has had a soldier's sergeant to teach him. But your cuffs show no fray, and your hands have the polish of a hairdresser. I shall assume you were a gentleman's gentleman before you were anything else." Grieve's eyes widened at the correctness of this dart. He nodded. Then, remembering his situation, steadied himself and looked from Holmes to Lestrade. "I've done nothing, sir. Mr. Barclay was strict as a bellman about his hours. After 6, I laid out his pipe and matches, brushed his coat and kept to the hall unless he rang. You left him at 10 minutes after 6, sir. He had me fetch a packet from the post. The foreign mail had brought it at noon and he had it locked in the drawer. Then he dismissed me." He was here, Grieve groped for an adjective and settled upon preoccupied. With whom did he correspond today? Holmes asked it, as if he had inquired about the weather. Grieve glanced at Lestrade and received a nod. 2 letters to Mr. Carstairs, sir, the fund treasurer, and one to a Mr. K. Penbury of Limehouse, I recall the name because it is odd, and a note to the glazier about a blemish in the new pane. He disliked the tiniest smear. He said the sea had taught him exactness. Holmes's lids drooped to slits. The new pane displeased him? In what regard? A ripple in the corner, sir, so he said. I could not see it. He held his head just so as if to catch a flaw in a mirror, and clicked his tongue. And the collar, Holmes added almost lazily. Mr. Barclay's fashion? Grieve looked surprised. Plain and neat, sir. Points inside. Like a parson. He would not abide the collar-out look, said it belonged to actors and other public prints. Holmes's gaze moved over the man's attire, returned to the face, and passed on. You have been long enough in service to know that a household develops habits which are as legible as a primer. Indulge me in one more. When Mr. Barclay wrote at his desk, upon which side lay his pen tray? On his right, sir. Mr. Barclay was right-handed. Holmes inclined his head as if at a small courtesy received. That will do for the present. I rely on your memory again, Mr. Grieve. It has already justified the position you hold. We took our leave of the scullery and stepped back into the hall, where Mrs. Hollis lingered in that tension of grief and authority, which keeps a house upright when its master has fallen. Holmes addressed her with the same quiet gentleness he reserves for old soldiers and faithful servants. Mr. Barclay sent for a glazier 2 weeks ago. What was the firm? Dunford and Son of Holborn, sir. They were recommended by Mr. Carstairs. There was much talk of plate glass and the newest methods. She hesitated. It seemed vanity to me, sir, for Mr. Barclay never invited company. But he said the garden deserved a proper view. Holmes thanked her and asked in the tone of routine what our supper had been, whether any ring had sounded, whether any door had been heard. Routine, that is, to the ear. Yet I knew that each answer fell upon some concealed scale within him. No bell had rung from the study. No visitor had called. There had been a brief clatter at 6:30. The gardener's canvas frame shifted by the wind, and then Mrs. Hollis had heard, or thought she had heard, a small sharp sound like china striking stone. After that, silence until Cribb's alarm. We returned once more to the study, and if the corpse had grown more fixed in its expression, it was only that my own mind had become more mobile. I recalled Grieve's phrase, preoccupied, and found my eye drawn again to the stained fold of paper beneath the demolished inkpot. Holmes kept his hands from it with a patience that always astonishes me, for he can be as swift as a stoat when the moment comes. Instead, he crouched at the French windows, and using the merest edge of his nail, teased from the inner sill a grain or two of black substance, which he slipped into a paper twist from his pocket. "You have it, then," said Lestrade, who had watched this ceremony with official hunger. "Not yet. But I have enough to make a morning of it." Holmes straightened, looked once more at the pale crescent upon the rug, a ghost of absence, if I may coin the phrase, and then crossed to the mantel, where he examined the bronze Neptune with an attention bordering upon affection. He weighed the figure in his palm, set it down, and marked the corner of the base with his forefinger. A bruise such as our good surgeon described might be made by that, or by its like. The malachite would have left green. This would leave only silence. "You think the weapon came from here?" I ventured. "I think the hand that struck did not wish the blow to speak." He replaced the bronze and gave me that slight sideways glance, which to others looks like indifference. "Watson, do you recall Cribb's insistence upon the left hand with the paper?" I did, and our careful Greaves noticed that the pen tray lay on the right, as is proper with a right-handed man. Holmes paused. There are hours when glass tells the truth of what it reflects, rather than of what it transmits. At dusk, with a lamp behind, a window may become a servant to lies if one knows how to command it. He would say no more. He asked Lestrade to send a man to Holborn at once for Dunford and Sons, invoice and fitter's notes, if such exist, and another to Mr. Carstairs for a statement of Mr. Barclay's movements and any complaint within the fund. Then, with a politeness that was only partly masked impatience, he asked that the latch, the sill, and the small ark upon the rug remain untouched. "You mean to try some experiment?" said Lestrade. "I mean to ask the morning to repeat the evening with fewer conspirators." He turned to the gardener outside, who still stood as if awaiting sentence under the sooty drip of the eaves. "Mr. Cribb, be so good as to present yourself at 7. Bring the canvas you were fixing and your memory, which is better than your comfort." We took our leave. In the cab, Holmes sat silent, eyes half closed, the forefinger of his right hand playing that faint tattoo upon his knee, which in him stands for a marching thought. When we reached Baker Street, he went directly to the mantel and, to my surprise, fetched down a small looking-glass from behind the books. He set it upon a chair, placed a lamp a little behind and to the side, darkened the room to the exact dimness of a November evening, and stood me at the window. "You are the gardener," he said. "What do you see, Watson? Not what you think you ought to see. What you see." I looked into the pane and found myself gazing not into the room but into a pale mockery of it, where my own outline floated, reversed and uncertain. And behind me, at a cunning angle, the small mirror presented not my countenance at all, but the lamp's oval and the edge of a chair. Holmes moved a hair's breadth, and the chair became startlingly the suggestion of a man's breast and shoulder. "There," said Holmes softly, and with that single syllable I knew that the morning would not be idle. The little demonstration with the mirror had left me unsettled, though Holmes himself betrayed nothing more than the faint curve of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. He extinguished the lamp, set the glass aside, and drew the curtains as if to close the matter for the night. Yet I knew by his silence that it had only just begun. He sat long into the small hours, pipe alight, the smoke wreathing him in a blue haze, while I, less patient, dozed uneasily in my chair. When at last I retired, I left him still gazing at the faint smudges he had coaxed from the sill, as though the dust itself had agreed to tell him a story, if only he could learn its alphabet. By morning the weather had changed. The drizzle had thickened into that yellow fog which clings to the very nostrils and turns the lamplighters into shapes from a phantasm. Holmes, however, greeted the day with brisk efficiency, his energy renewed by whatever chain of thought had carried him through the night. He broke his fast on coffee alone and urged me to eat quickly, for the cab was already waiting below. We returned to Montague Street to find Lestrade in command of his constables, his expression half irritation, half hope. He handed Holmes a paper, Dunford & Son's bill for the new panes, specifying polished Belgian plate glass, ground true, supplied and fixed by apprentice under master's supervision. Holmes read it as a man reads a playbill, folded it with care, and slipped it into his pocket. "You have your gardener," Holmes said. "Let him repeat his testimony with his eyes and hands, not his tongue, and send the maid for that canvas he was spreading. The conditions must be as they were." Cribb came at once, still stiff in posture, as though afraid his honesty might be mistaken for stubbornness. At Holmes's instruction, he took his place by the cucumber frames, stooped to secure the canvas, and then raised his head. His gesture was identical to that of the evening before. The quick, startled glance upward, the frozen stare, the pointing finger toward the bright rectangle of glass. "There, sir." Just as I said, Holmes beckoned me to stand where Berkeley would have sat, pen in hand, lamp to the right. I obeyed, and as the fog dulled the daylight, the interior of the study became half a reflection, half a scene. My own face, reversed, swam faintly on the pane, but behind it, here was the trick. Holmes had placed the small mirror from Baker Street upon a chair just inside the door. Its angle was such that it cast, not my likeness, but his own lean profile upon the glass, elongated and unfamiliar, yet horribly convincing. Even I, who knew the contrivance, felt for a moment that a stranger gazed out from the room. "You perceive it, Watson?" Holmes's voice was low, yet edged with triumph. The gardener saw not through the window, but upon it, a phantom conjured by reflection, made credible by dusk and a lamp. Thus a stranger who was no stranger at all. Lestrade muttered, "But why should anyone arrange such a deception? And who could profit by it?" Holmes turned his head slightly, the ghostly double vanishing with the motion. "That is the question which will yield us the hand that struck. For, cease, you cannot mistake the intent. Some person wished it to be known that a man other than Berkeley was present. The gardener was to carry the tale, and carry it he has, with all the force of his honest conviction. Our task is to learn who stood where I stand, who held a paper in the left hand, so that the reflection suggested a left-handed reader, and who departed unseen while Berkeley lay dying at his desk. We left Cribb bewildered but vindicated, and Holmes returned to the study floor. He crouched by the pale crescent upon the carpet, running his finger along the arc. "A chair leg," he murmured, "but not Berkeley's own. His chair fits the indentations here. This arc belongs to another chair, placed close to the window for the purpose of reflection. When it was withdrawn, the pile remembered its passing. A ghost of furniture for a ghost of a man." Lestrade scratched his chin. "Then someone within this very room set the stage. And yet the door was locked." Holmes smiled faintly. Locks, my dear Lestrade, are but invitations to ingenuity. Berkeley's key was in the lock inside, yes, but the valet, I believe, has shown himself a master of service, a man accustomed to quiet entries and silent footfalls. I reserve judgment until I know more of Mr. Grieve. At that moment, Mrs. Hollis entered, holding out an envelope. This had arrived in the morning post, sir. It was addressed to Mr. Berkeley, but as she faltered. Well, I thought you might wish to see it. Holmes took it, opened it with delicate fingers, and extracted a single sheet. The writing was bold, the ink fresh. He read it once, twice, then passed it to me. The message contained only a line. The glass tells no lies. You will answer for Bombay. You will answer for Bombay. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Bombay, Watson. That city breeds debts which travel farther than steamships. Berkeley had been in the trade. He made his fortune in the ports. Somewhere there lies the true beginning of this affair. A reflection in London, but a shadow cast from India. Lestrade frowned. You think this has to do with the merchant's past? I am certain of it. A man does not pay so dearly for glass unless he fears what may be seen or reflected upon it. Holmes folded the letter, slid it into his pocket beside the glazier's bill, and took up his hat. The path begins at Bombay, but we must tread it in London's mud. First, Lestrade, you will allow me a few words more with the valet. Then I think Mr. Carstairs of the fund will have something to tell us, if only we ask the question from the proper side. Holmes's eyes turned once more to the window, where the faint outline of his own face hovered like a double upon the pane. He tapped it lightly with his forefinger. The glass tells no lies, Watson, only the liar behind it. Holmes requested that Grieve be brought once more, and the valet entered with that same guarded air, as if every breath he drew might be taken for guilt. Holmes, with his customary disarming politeness, gestured him to a chair, and began not with accusation but with a seemingly idle inquiry. Mr. Grieve, you have lived in service, and service, as you know, is a life of observation. Tell me, when you brushed Mr. Berkeley's coat last evening, did you notice whether he carried any papers in the inner pocket? Grieve looked startled. None, sir. He always kept his papers locked in the desk. Indeed, and yet one such paper was seen in his hand, or appeared so, at the very moment the gardener looked up. Curious, is it not, that a man who disliked even a collar out of place should flaunt a sheet before the lamplight? The valet's eyes flickered, but he answered steadily. I cannot explain that, sir. I saw no paper. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze fixed upon the young man. You cannot explain it, or you will not. You are left-handed, are you not, Mr. Grieve? The denial sprang to the lips, but Holmes forestalled it with a small motion of the hand. Do not trouble yourself. The polishing rag you use bears the marks of leftward drag, and the shine on your boots is heavier upon the left side. It is a trifle, but trifles are the marrow of truth. Grieve swallowed hard. He looked to Lestrade, then back to Holmes, as though weighing which master would claim him. At last he said in a low voice, I served in another household before Mr. Berkeley's, in Bombay, sir. That is why he engaged me. He said a man who knew the climate could be trusted with his comforts. Holmes's eyes brightened, and he cast a swift glance toward me. You hear, Watson? Bombay again. And was it in Bombay that you also made the acquaintance of Mr. K. Penbury? The name struck home. Grieve's composure cracked, and though he did not answer, the blood drained from his face until it was almost waxen. Holmes observed him keenly, then with a gentleness that belied the steel beneath, said only, That will do for the present. You may go. When the valet had been escorted out, Lestrade burst forth with his usual impatience. That fellow is up to the neck in it. You saw his face. We have only to press him, and he will yield. Holmes shook his head. To press him now would be to close the door before we have seen the room beyond it. He is useful precisely because he has not yet been forced to choose between silence and confession. No, Lestrade, let him walk upon the wire a little longer. A man reveals his balance best when he fears the fall. He turned then to Mrs. Hollis and requested to see any correspondence Mr. Berkeley had preserved from his years in Bombay. After a brief search, she produced a tin box from a cupboard. It contained invoices, shipping lists, and several letters tied with cord. Holmes handled them swiftly, noting addresses and signatures. Twice the name Penbury appeared, both times connected with disputes over unpaid consignments of opium and textiles. The tone of the letters was acrid, the threats ill-concealed beneath the politeness of trade. There lies the root, Holmes murmured. Berkeley prospered. Penbury festered. Men who brood on injustice are fertile ground for revenge. He selected one letter, dated 15 years before, and slipped it into his pocket beside the new note which had arrived that morning. Then he rose with sudden decision. "We go now to Limehouse, Watson. There we shall see if Mr. Penbury's name is mere ink upon paper or flesh still walking in the fog." Lestrade protested that his men should attend, but Holmes insisted that too many uniforms would only alarm the quarry. Thus it was that Holmes and I, with the inspector in reluctant tow, found ourselves jolting through the damp streets until the air grew salt with the river, and the alleys narrowed to crooked channels of brick. Limehouse was alive with its usual confusion of seamen, hawkers, and the peculiar half-caste life of the docks. We inquired discreetly, and soon a ragged boy guided us to a lodging-house above a chandlery. There, in a room that smelt of tar and cheap gin, we encountered a man whose appearance told its own story. He was gaunt, with dark hair streaked white, his eyes sunken yet burning, and his left hand wrapped in a rag that might have concealed deformity or disease. Holmes introduced himself with grave courtesy. "Mr. Penbury, I believe." "Formerly of Bombay, now of Limehouse." The man started, his gaze darting from Holmes to Lestrade and then to me. He tried to bluster, but the words failed. At last he said hoarsely, "Berkeley is dead, then." Holmes inclined his head. "You are remarkably well informed for one who claims no recent correspondence." Penbury laughed, a sound without mirth. "The glass tells no lies, Mr. Holmes, I warned him. I told him he would answer for Bombay. And now he has." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You claim, then, to have been present in Montague Street last evening." "I claim nothing. I needed only the truth to be seen, and it was seen. The gardener knows." Berkeley saw his own fate in the glass he prized so dearly. His words had the ring of obsession rather than reason, and yet within them lay the very echo of the note delivered that morning. Lestrade's hand went to his pocket as though itching for the manacles, but Holmes lifted a restraining hand. "Not yet. A madman declares his guilt too loudly. The sane villain whispers it where he thinks no ear can hear. We must discern which we have here." He bent close to Penbury, his voice low but compelling. "Tell me, what was in Berkeley's hand when you last saw him?" Penbury's lips trembled. "A letter," he said at last. "My letter. The one he should have answered 15 years ago." Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "Then I think, Watson, we have glimpsed the shape of the snare. Whether the prey is the man before us, or another who uses him as a mask, remains to be proved. But I tell you this, the glass has not yet spoken its final word." Holmes's gaze lingered on Penbury with that curious mixture of sympathy and severity which he reserved for men who were both victim and villain. The gaunt figure trembled, as if the very memory of Bombay shook him. Lestrade, impatient as ever, leaned forward with the air of a man ready to close the net. "You hear it, Holmes. He as good as confesses. Shall I put him in irons?" Holmes held up a hand. "Patience, Inspector. A confession spoken in riddles is no confession at all. If we cage him now, we may never know who dangled the bait before him." Penbury, roused by the suggestion of manacles, lifted his head with sudden wildness. "You may bind me, but it will not silence the truth. He cheated me there in Bombay, stripped me of the very trade that was my life. I wrote to him, begged him, cursed him, and he would not answer. But the glass answers for all men. It showed what must be seen. Holmes leaned against the table, his voice smooth as a surgeon's scalpel. "And yet, curiously, the glass showed not you, Mr. Penbury, but another." The gardener swore the face was unfamiliar, not Berkeley's and not yours. He described a man younger, stronger, with collar points turned outward. "Why should your vengeance employ a mask you do not wear?" The question struck Penbury like cold water. His hands twitched, and for a moment he seemed on the verge of some admission. Then he sagged back, muttering incoherently, words of India, of debts unpaid, of betrayal. It was as if his mind retreated into the past, leaving us with only fragments. Holmes regarded him with something like pity. "You see, Lestrade, this man is no hand at subtle contrivances. He is eaten hollow by grievance. But to arrange a deception with glass and reflection, that requires steadier nerves and a practical cunning which I do not find here." Lestrade grumbled, but he obeyed when Holmes requested Penbury be held for questioning, not yet charged. As we left the lodging-house, Holmes drew me aside. "Watson, note the ragged bandage on his left hand. He clutched it as though hiding more than pain. It may conceal injury, but not the kind that comes from striking a blow with bronze. The mark upon Berkeley's temple was made with precision. Penbury could not have delivered it in his present state. Then who did, Holmes? That, my dear fellow, is the riddle. And riddles, like reflections, may show one face while hiding another. The fog thickened as we returned to Baker Street. Holmes paced the sitting room with long strides, his mind evidently turning some invisible object in its grasp. At last he halted, lit his pipe, and began to speak as if delivering a lecture to the empty air. Consider, Watson. We have 3 strands. First, a man of wealth and reputation is found dead in a locked room, a bruise upon his temple, no weapon at hand. Second, a gardener swears he saw not his master, but another man at the study window, paper in left hand. Third, a letter arrives speaking of Bombay, signed with no name but echoing Penbury's old grievance. Now ask yourself, who profits? Berkeley is silenced. Penbury, long discredited, is instantly suspected, his threats giving colour to the charge. The gardener's honest testimony supports the tale, yet it is a tale manufactured by a trick of optics. Someone arranged that reflection, someone who knew the habits of the household, who could place a chair in the proper spot, who understood the window's deceptive power. The valet, I murmured. Precisely. Edwin Grieve. He is left-handed, as the gardener described. He knew Berkeley's aversion to the outward collar. He could summon the exact posture that would suggest a stranger, because he had watched his master's ways until he could mimic them. And he knew also of Penbury's past quarrel, for he himself admitted service in Bombay. What better cloak than to rouse the ghost of an old enemy and make him wear the guilt? But why, Holmes? What motive has a valet to strike down his master? Holmes tapped his pipe against the grate, his eyes half closed. That is the final piece. Berkeley's papers will tell us. Somewhere in those letters lies a secret strong enough to bind a servant to crime. Our speculation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, his face flushed from the damp. We have found something, Mr. Holmes. In searching Penbury's lodgings, my men discovered a packet of papers, drafts of letters, and one receipt made out to Grieve, payment for errands done these past weeks. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Just so. Our valet and our ruined merchant bound together. But in what enterprise? That is the question. He examined the receipt, noting the date, a fortnight ago, precisely when the new glass was fitted. A payment there, not for errands, but for conspiracy. Holmes rose at once. Come, Watson. Lestrade, keep your men on Penbury, but say nothing yet of our suspicions. Grieve must not be frightened into flight. This evening I shall contrive an experiment at Montague Street that will place him where no trick of glass can save him. And so it was decided. As the lamps were lit and the fog pressed its clammy hand against the panes, Holmes prepared his trap, his every motion charged with suppressed energy. I could not yet see how he meant to spring it, but I knew, as always, that the hour of revelation drew near. Holmes insisted that we return to Montague Street under cover of the evening, for he claimed the truth of the crime could only be revealed beneath the same conditions in which it had been contrived. The fog had thickened to a greasy pall that blurred the lamplight into wavering halos, and our cab moved through the dim streets as though through some half-finished dream. When we arrived, the constable at the railings admitted us without ceremony, and within the hall we found Mrs. Hollis, pale but steady, as though grief had made a quiet fortress of her duty. Holmes asked that she gather the household in the study, servants and all. Lestrade raised an eyebrow, but Holmes only murmured, "The stage is prepared, Inspector. We require the actors." Soon the maid, the gardener, Cribb, and Edwin Grieve filed in, uneasy under the steady gaze of the police. Holmes directed that the lamps be lit in the same position as on the night of Berkeley's death, and he himself dragged a chair to the spot near the French window, where the faint crescent still marred the carpet. "Mr. Cribb," said Holmes, "you will kindly take your position in the garden and look up at this window as before. Mrs. Hollis, stand by the door. Watson, take your place near the escritoire. Lestrade, position yourself beside me." Grieve shifted uncomfortably, but Holmes fixed him with a look that admitted no refusal. "And you, Mr. Grieve, you will oblige us by sitting here, as though you were Mr. Berkeley himself at his desk. Take this paper in your left hand and wait until I signal." Grieve hesitated, then complied, the sheet trembling faintly in his fingers. Cribb outside raised his head at the appointed moment, and I saw his eyes widen as before. He called out through the fogged glass, "There, sir. There's the man again, just as that evening." Holmes turned to the assembled company. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, how easily an honest man may be deceived by reflection. It was no stranger at all he glimpsed, but only the image of a servant seated at the proper angle with lamp behind. The plate glass, so true and polished, betrayed him by its very clarity." Greaves sprang to his feet, his face white. "It proves nothing. I obeyed your orders only now. You cannot make me guilty of a crime I did not commit." Holmes's voice was calm. "No, but you betray yourself by your eagerness to deny. You alone knew the exact habits of your master. You knew he would never wear his collar points outward, and so you affected that fashion yourself to create the impression of another man. You are left-handed, and so you held the paper in your left. You placed this chair here close by the window, leaving its ghost upon the carpet. You arranged it all that the gardener's eye might see a phantom and speak of it after. And when Berkeley protested, or when you pressed your demand, you struck him down with the bronze Neptune upon the mantel. The silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire." Greaves' lips moved, but no sound came. Holmes continued, his voice sharper now. "You imagined the matter perfect. The door was locked, the key within, the body alone. The reflection pointed to a stranger. The note of Bombay delivered this very morning was the final stroke, meant to draw suspicion upon Penbury, the ruined merchant. But you overreached yourself. Penbury may rave of injustice, but he has not the cunning to contrive such a theatre. You, however, have both the knowledge and the nerve." Lestrade stepped forward, the iron already in his hand. Greaves started as if to bolt, but the gardener barred the way, his broad figure filling the door. Cornered, the valet gave a harsh, broken laugh. "You speak clever words, Mr. Holmes, but where is your proof? Where is the weapon?" "You have none." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "On the contrary. The weapon is there upon the mantel. The bronze Neptune still bears a faint smear upon the corner of its base. A smear not of blood. Carpets absorb that, but of ink. For when you struck Berkeley, the paper he clutched was driven against his temple, the ink pot shattering beside him. The surgeon saw only the bruise, but I with my lens found the minute grains upon the sill and the dusting of black upon the bronze. You failed to wipe it clean. Greaves' defiance faltered. His mouth opened as though to fashion another denial, but the words shriveled. He sank back into the chair, the paper still in his left hand, and covered his face. "He would not yield," he muttered. "He promised me a fortune in Bombay, years of service, risk, and disease. When I returned, he cast me off with nothing but a place at his table as servant. I deserved more. It was mine by right." Lestrade snapped the manacles upon his wrists with grim efficiency. "That will do for confession." Holmes, however, bent once more to the desk. He lifted the ink-stained sheet that had lain beneath the shattered pot. "Here is your true folly, Greaves. This paper was Berkeley's reply to Penbury at last. He was ready to acknowledge the debt, perhaps even to make amends. Had you but waited, a day your grievance might have been answered without crime. But impatience is the companion of folly, and folly the herald of justice. We left Montague Street with Greaves in custody, and the household at last released from its vigil. As the cab bore us back through the fog, I could not help but marvel at the chain of reasoning that had begun with a gardener's honest eyes, and ended in the exposure of a murderer's cunning. Holmes sat silent, the shadow of fatigue upon his face. At last he said, almost to himself, "It is a curious irony, Watson, that a window prized for its clarity should serve as the mask of a lie. Yet in the end, glass tells no lies. It reflects only what is placed before it. And so it was with Greaves. The image of his own deceit stared back at him until he could not escape it. I ventured that he had once again accomplished the impossible, but Holmes shook his head, gazing into the fog as though it concealed another problem waiting to be summoned. Not impossible, Watson, merely inevitable, once one listens to what the glass has to say. The night after Greaves' arrest was a restless one. Though the case seemed concluded, I could not shake the image of the valet's bowed head and muttered confession, nor the words Holmes had spoken as we rode home through the fog, that the glass tells no lies. Yet in the stillness of Baker Street, with the coals glowing low and Holmes pacing restlessly, I began to suspect he was not altogether satisfied. His pipe smoked furiously, His steps carried him from hearth to window and back again, and at intervals he stopped short, muttering some phrase beneath his breath. At last I could bear it no longer. "Surely, Holmes," I said, "the matter is ended. Grieve confessed, Lestrade has his proof, and the weapon lies upon the mantel of Montague Street. What more can remain?" Holmes halted and regarded me with that faint smile which always suggests I have missed some hidden corner. "My dear Watson, if cases ended with confession alone, Scotland Yard would have no need of me. No, Grieve's words are those of a desperate man cornered by circumstance. True, he struck Berkeley, but the hand was driven by more than resentment of fortune denied. Consider the note that arrived that morning. 'The glass tells no lies. You will answer for Bombay.' That was no invention of Grieve's. It was penned by another hand." I frowned. But Penbury himself admitted writing such warnings. He was consumed with grievance. "Just so," Holmes replied, "and yet his ravings serve another's purpose. The receipt discovered in his lodgings, payment from Grieve, tells us they were not adversaries, but accomplices, at least for a time. The question is, did Grieve use Penbury or did Penbury use Grieve? Until that is answered, the crime is only half understood." The following morning, Holmes announced we would call again upon Penbury in Limehouse. Lestrade, still flushed with the triumph of having a prisoner in chains, grumbled at the necessity, but joined us nevertheless. We found Penbury in a sullen mood, watched closely by 2 constables. He greeted Holmes with the bitterness of a man who believes truth has betrayed him. "So," he sneered, "the servant has taken the blame, and you think I am nothing but a mad old merchant with a bandaged hand and a mind of grievances." Holmes took a chair opposite him, his gaze never wavering. "Not mad, Mr. Penbury, misled, perhaps. You wrote letters demanding satisfaction, and Berkeley, I believe, at last prepared an answer. Did Grieve tell you of this?" Penbury shook his head sharply. "Grieve promised only that justice would come. He said he could make Berkeley tremble, that the window itself would expose him. I thought it no more than empty words, until I heard Berkeley was dead." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And you never set foot in Montague Street that evening?" "As God sees me, no. My strength would not have carried me there, nor my courage." He lifted his bandaged hand. "The fever in Bombay took more than trade from me. I could not strike down a man if I wished to." Holmes regarded him long, then turned to Lestrade. "You see, Inspector, the accomplice is weaker than the servant imagined. Grieve required Penbury's letters to plant suspicion, but the blow itself was his alone. Yet there remains a deeper question. Why should Grieve risk murder at all? What treasure lay in Berkeley's possession that drove him to it? We returned to Montague Street once more, Holmes demanding access to Berkeley's locked escritoire. Mrs. Hollis, though wearied by repeated intrusions, produced the keys. Holmes examined the drawers with meticulous care, turning out correspondence, shipping ledgers, and a packet of sealed documents bound with red ribbon. He opened one, read swiftly, and his face sharpened. "Watson, here lies the motive. Berkeley had been trustee of the Sailors' Widows' Fund, and these papers reveal irregularities, money advanced, accounts falsified. Who, think you, served as Berkeley's intermediary in such matters?" "Grieve," I ventured. "Precisely. He was not only servant but agent, handling correspondence Berkeley wished hidden from the committee. When Berkeley resolved to set matters right, see here, this draft confession, Grieve's ruin was inevitable. He chose instead to silence the man who could expose him and to cast suspicion on Penbury, whose letters provided the perfect cloak. The logic struck me like a hammer blow. Grieve had not merely struck from resentment, but from fear of exposure, fear of disgrace that would end more than his position. Holmes gathered the papers, sealed them in an envelope, and handed them to Lestrade. "There is your case complete, Inspector. Fraud, conspiracy, and at last murder. The glass may have reflected a phantom, but the truth is plain enough." Lestrade grunted, half reluctant to concede. "You make it sound neat as a ledger, Holmes. But you must admit, had it not been for the gardener's testimony, we might never have looked to the window at all." Holmes inclined his head. "Every case requires its honest witness. Cribb saw only what was set before him, but his candor was the spark that lit the trail. I do not disparage it. On the contrary, It proves again that innocence is the truest ally of reason. As we left the Berkeley house for the final time, Holmes seemed at last at ease. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing patches of weak November sunlight on the damp brickwork. In the cab, I ventured to express my admiration for his untangling of the affair. He shook his head with that dry amusement I knew so well. "You give me too much credit, Watson. The truth was always in the glass. It reflected not only the figure of a man, but the nature of deception itself. Men imagine they can control what others see, but reflections are treacherous things. They reveal more than intended. Grieve thought to show us Penbury, but he showed us only his own hand, left and guilty." I pressed him then upon one final point. "Holmes, do you ever feel the weight of it, to see so clearly the motives that drive men to betrayal, to murder?" His expression grew distant, almost melancholy. "At times, Watson, but I comfort myself with this. Though men lie, glass does not. In a world of deception, one may always find some surface that returns the truth, if only one knows how to look." He leaned back, eyes closing, the faintest smile upon his lips. For my part, I felt again that curious mixture of awe and unease which his brilliance so often stirred in me. The case was ended, the culprit in chains, yet I could not help but think that Holmes had peered into more than a window in Montague Street. He had glimpsed the very reflection of human folly, and found, as ever, that it bore the face of crime. Crime. The conclusion Holmes had drawn seemed to settle all doubts, yet in the days that followed, I found him unusually reflective, as though the matter, neatly bound though it was, had left behind a faint dissonance. He would sit at the window of Baker Street, violin silent beside him, eyes following the procession of hansom cabs through the fog, and I knew that in his mind he was still in Montague Street, still staring into that flawless pane of Belgian glass. It was only when Lestrade called upon us again 3 mornings later that I understood why Holmes had not yet closed the ledger of the case. The inspector was visibly perturbed. "It's Grieve, Mr. Holmes. He has turned silent as stone. Beyond the single outburst you witnessed, he will say nothing more, not even to his own counsel. The papers, the Neptune, the gardener's testimony, aye, they will hang him well enough. But there is the matter of Penbury. The magistrate is not satisfied with his release. Too much smoke still hangs about him. Was he no more than a tool, or was he the fire itself? I must have it clear." Holmes set down his pipe. "Quite right, Lestrade. Half-truths make for dangerous justice. Come, Watson, we shall pay our Bombay merchant one last visit." We found Penbury again in Limehouse, in the same dim room, though this time there was a weary resignation about him, as though the struggle to prove or deny had drained away. Holmes took a seat, laid a small bundle of documents on the table, and regarded the man with a steadiness that compelled speech without demand. "Mr. Penbury," he said softly, "I have here letters of yours written years ago, full of wrath against Berkeley. They were clumsy weapons, yet they have been sharpened into daggers by another's hand. Tell me, how came you to place them in Grieve's keeping?" Penbury's shoulders twitched. "I never placed them there. They were stolen, from my trunk when I thought him a friend. He came to me, spoke of justice, flattered my anger. I showed him the old papers in my folly, and soon enough they were gone. When the news reached me of Berkeley's death, I knew I was undone." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. You were never meant to wield the blade, only to stand as the shadow behind it. Grieve needed your grievance to clothe his crime. He promised you justice, but meant only to furnish himself with a scapegoat." A long silence fell. At last Penbury whispered, "Then Berkeley is gone, and I am left with nothing but the ashes of my hate." Holmes rose, and his voice held a gentleness I seldom heard. "Better ashes than the rope, Mr. Penbury. Leave vengeance to men less crippled by it. You are free of Grieve's chain now if you choose to be." When we returned to Baker Street, Lestrade, though gruff in manner, was visibly relieved. The weight of doubt was lifted. Penbury would not be pursued further. Grieve alone would stand trial, his frauds and violence laid bare. Yet Holmes's manner remained contemplative. He seated himself by the fire and spoke in that low tone which always marked his deepest deductions. "Watson, do you observe how greed and resentment intertwine like 2 strands of rope? Grieve coveted fortune he thought withheld. Penbury nursed injustice. Berkeley sought to bury misdeeds in silence. Each man saw his reflection in the glass, yet none recognized himself. That was the true deceit, the lie men tell not to others but to themselves. I ventured that he had unmasked each with his usual brilliance, and that justice, though stern, would be satisfied. He smiled faintly. Justice, yes, but I confess there is something tragic in it. Berkeley meant to set his affairs right at last. Penbury, in his frailty, desired only recognition of wrong. Grieve alone chose the darker path, and by his hand all three were destroyed. The dead man, the ruined exile, and the servant whose cunning could not save him from truth. In that glass of Montague Street, Watson, we see not only a crime but a parable. I could not but agree, though my thoughts returned again and again to the moment in the study when the gardener's honest cry had pierced the silence. How narrow is the line between what the eye sees and what the mind believes. The trial, when it came, was brief and conclusive. The evidence Holmes had marshalled left no room for doubt, and Grieve, still silent, heard his sentence with a face of stone. Penbury was never summoned, save as witness to his own folly, and thereafter vanished into the obscurity of the river wards. Mrs. Hollis carried on the household for a time, but with Berkeley gone, the estate soon passed into the care of distant kin. It was on the evening of the verdict that I found Holmes once more at the violin. The tune was soft, almost sorrowful, and when at last he lowered the bow, I remarked upon it. "You play as though you mourn." "Not for Grieve," he replied. "The law will attend to him." "But for the waste, Watson, the waste of human striving turned awry. To think that a pane of glass, polished to perfection, should become the stage for so pitiful a deception. The irony would be comical, were it not so deeply human." He set the violin aside and leaned back, eyes closed, the faint smile of abstraction upon his lips. For myself, I felt the familiar mixture of awe and humility. Once again I had witnessed how his mind, keen as a scalpel, could carve through the veils of misdirection to the very marrow of truth. Yet beneath the triumph lay that melancholy which clings to all great revelations, that in the end Holmes had not merely solved a crime, but laid bare the frailties that make men criminals. And so the case of the window that reflected another man passed into memory, one more entry in the crowded annals of Baker Street. But whenever I chance upon a glass pane at dusk, with a lamp behind me and my own figure cast upon it, I recall the gardener's cry, the valet's mask, and Holmes's final words, that glass, like truth, tells no lies. The winter passed. Yet the memory of Montague Street lingered, like the faint impression left upon glass after a careless hand has touched it. Though Grieve had been condemned and Penbury released to his obscurity, I often caught Holmes staring at the smoke of his pipe with that peculiar, far-away look which told me his mind still lingered on the case. One night in January, when the frost lay thick upon Baker Street and the hansoms left brittle ruts in the snow, he spoke of it once more. "You will recall, Watson, that Grieve's motive was twofold: resentment at fortune denied and terror of exposure. Yet I cannot help but wonder whether Berkeley himself bore a measure of responsibility. Men who bury their misdeeds in silence too often find the earth shifts beneath them." I reminded him that Berkeley had begun to draft a confession, and that perhaps his conscience was at last stirred to action. Holmes gave a dry smile. "A conscience awakened too late is like a lamp lit after the house has burned. It may illuminate the ashes, but it will not save the timbers." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lestrade, stamping snow from his boots and rubbing his hands against the chill. He carried a small packet, which he laid upon the table with a look of grim satisfaction. "Thought you might wish to see this, Mr. Holmes. It was found in Grieve's lodgings after the trial, overlooked in a false bottom of his trunk. Letters, ledgers, the like. They'll serve only to blacken his name further, but I reckoned you'd find them of interest." Holmes untied the string with deft fingers. Within lay several papers, yellowed but neatly ordered, written in Berkeley's own hand. He scanned them swiftly, his eyes narrowing. So here is the missing piece. Watson, do you see? These entries record transfers of the Sailors' Widows' Fund into private accounts, yet not Berkeley's alone. Grieve's name appears repeatedly. He was no mere servant, but a partner in corruption. When Berkeley sought to amend his course, Grieve foresaw his own ruin. The blow was inevitable. Lestrade gave a grunt. "Well, the rope has done its work. The world is rid of him. I dare say the committee will hush the scandal. They don't like their charities smelling of fraud." Holmes folded the papers with care. Fraud concealed is fraud preserved. The widows will have their due only when sunlight is cast upon the accounts. If the committee chooses silence, then they are as guilty as Berkeley and Grieve. It struck me then that Holmes was more severe than usual. He spoke not as a detective merely, but as a judge, and I realized how deeply the matter had pressed upon him. Perhaps it was the nature of the crime, that a pane of glass meant to brighten a study had been turned into an instrument of deceit that had fixed itself in his imagination. 2 days later, we received a visitor who deepened the impression still further. Mrs. Hollis, the faithful housekeeper of Montague Street, appeared at our door, wrapped against the cold. Her face lined by more care than years alone could account for. She asked to speak with Holmes privately, but he insisted I remain, assuring her that my discretion was absolute. She placed upon the table a small parcel. "This was among Mr. Berkeley's effects, sir. The committee men came and rummaged through everything, but I could not bring myself to hand them this. It is a diary of sorts, his thoughts on the fund and on Mr. Grieve. Perhaps you will know what to do with it." Holmes opened the little leather-bound volume, its pages closely filled with Berkeley's neat script. He read a passage aloud. "Grieve presses me daily for assurances. He believes I cannot act without him, yet I fear his ambition grows beyond service. I must put my affairs in order, lest the committee discover what we both have hidden. It is time at last to make amends." Holmes closed the book gently. "You did well to bring this, Mrs. Hollis. It confirms all we suspected and more." Berkeley's resolve was genuine. He meant to right his wrongs, but his servant forestalled him. Such ironies are the marrow of tragedy. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "He was a stern master, sir, but not unkind. I cannot think how he came to this." Holmes bowed his head. "The seeds of ruin are often planted in silence, and they sprout in the dark. Take comfort that he wished at last to do what was right. That desire, though unfulfilled, redeems him in part." After she had gone, Holmes lingered long over the diary, as though reluctant to lay it aside. At last he said, "Watson, cases such as these remind me why I mistrust appearances. A reflection in glass, a servant's obedience, a merchant's respectability. Each may conceal the opposite of what it shows. Truth is never the first thing one sees." I asked whether the matter was now finally concluded. He gave a rare, almost wistful smile. "Concluded, in fact, perhaps, but not in lesson. The window of Montague Street has taught us more than the name of a murderer. It has shown us that every man, when confronted with his reflection, must answer whether he sees himself truly or another face altogether." That night, as I set down my notes of the affair, I realized the story had no simple ending. Berkeley was dead, Grieve condemned, Penbury broken, and yet the true weight of the case lay not in the courtroom, but in that pane of glass, still standing silent in Montague Street, reflecting whoever passed before it. And I thought with a shiver that perhaps Holmes was right, that the glass, in its pitiless honesty, had shown not merely the shape of a crime, but the hidden selves of all who gazed into it. The weeks that followed Mrs. Hollis's visit slipped by with the slow relentlessness of a London winter. The case of Montague Street had already been set down in the papers, Grieve's execution noted in a few clipped paragraphs, Penbury's name scarcely mentioned at all. Yet Holmes returned to the subject with a persistence that told me it had not released him. Often I found him at the mantel, the little diary in his hand, turning its pages not as a man reads for knowledge, but as though the words themselves were a puzzle he had yet to complete. It was on one such evening, when the fire burned low and the fog pressed heavily against the panes of Baker Street, that he spoke again of Berkeley. "Watson, I have turned this affair every way, and still I am struck by the same irony. Berkeley's ruin was not wrought by his enemies, but by his servant, by one who shared his secrets, aided his concealment, and at last destroyed him when silence grew too heavy. How often, I wonder, does treachery wear the livery of loyalty?" I answered that it was a question for philosophers, not detectives. He smiled faintly, though without mirth. "Perhaps. Yet I cannot help but see in Grieve's face the reflection of 100 others who have stood behind their masters with eyes full of obedience and hearts full of calculation." Our conversation was broken by a knock at the door. A boy from the committee of the Sailors' Widows' Fund had come, bearing a letter addressed to Holmes. The committee, he explained, had resolved to open a public inquiry into the irregularities Berkeley's papers had revealed, and they desired Holmes's counsel. Holmes dismissed the boy with a nod and broke the seal. He read the letter in silence, then handed it to me. They mean to restore the missing sums, to publish an account and to honor Barclay's intention of amends. It will not undo the crime, but it will prevent its shadow from lingering. He rose then, restless, and paced the room. Do you not see, Watson? Even in his death, Barclay compels truth. His glass showed not only a phantom, but the necessity of reflection. The committee would never have acted but for the exposure of his secret, however grimly it came about. I suggested that in some strange sense justice had extended beyond the hanging of Grieve, reaching into the realm of restitution. Holmes paused, the faintest glint in his eye. Yes, justice rarely arrives in the form men expect. Sometimes it wears the black cap of the judge, sometimes the cold mirror of conscience. In Montague Street it wore both. For several days thereafter, Holmes occupied himself with smaller matters, trifling cases of theft and missing documents, yet I could see his mind drift back to the larger lesson. One evening, as he tuned his violin, he remarked almost absently, I have thought often of Cribb, the gardener, an honest man, deceived not by malice of his own, but by the cunning of another. His eyes saw truly, yet his truth was bent into falsehood. That is the danger of appearances, Watson. They can make accomplices of the innocent. I replied that without Cribb's testimony, we might never have understood the nature of the trick. Holmes inclined his head. Quite so. Innocence is unwittingly the sharpest witness of all. It tells not what it wishes to see, but what it cannot help but see. That is why deception must always collapse in the end. It cannot bear the weight of truth spoken without intent. It was not until early spring that the matter was finally laid to rest. A notice appeared in the Times. The committee of the Sailors' Widows' Fund had repaid every missing pound. Penbury had been quietly conveyed to a charitable asylum beyond London, and Mrs. Hollis had retired with a pension granted in Barclay's name. Holmes read the notice aloud, folded the paper, and for the first time since the case began I saw genuine contentment upon his face. Thus the circle closes, Watson. A crime born in Bombay, reflected in London, and extinguished at last by the very truth it sought to bury. It is a tidy resolution. I remarked that he seemed almost reconciled to the tragedy. He shook his head gently. Reconciled perhaps, but not unmoved. Every pane of glass we pass may conceal another such story, a reflection mistaken, a truth distorted, a life overturned. It is well to remember, lest we forget how fragile our certainties are. That night, as he lifted the violin and drew from it a strain of music soft as breath, I wrote the final lines of my record. The case of the window that reflected another man had begun with a gardener's startled cry, grown into a web of fraud and murder, and ended with restitution and silence. Yet in its heart lay a lesson as clear and pitiless as the glass itself, that men may contrive illusions, may cloak guilt in shadows or reflections, but in the end truth will return the gaze, unflinching. I laid down my pen with a sense of solemnity. For once I did not feel the triumph of victory, nor even the relief of conclusion, but rather a sober admiration for the strange justice that had passed through Montague Street. And as Holmes's bow moved across the strings, filling the room with a melody at once mournful and serene, I knew the matter would linger with us both, not as a case solved, but as a mirror in which we had glimpsed, however briefly, the many faces of truth. The spring sunlight had begun to soften the soot of Baker Street when Holmes at last laid aside Barclay's diary and pronounced the case complete. The committee had restored the funds, the scandal was hushed, Grieve's fate was sealed, and Penbury's name faded into the obscurity from which it had briefly emerged. Yet as we sat by the open window one mild afternoon, the hum of carriages rising from the street below, I sensed Holmes had reserved one final observation, as though he had not yet permitted himself the closing line of a problem that had occupied him for months. You see, Watson, he began, his voice carrying the deliberate weight of a man delivering judgment. This affair was never about a locked room or a shattered ink pot. Those were but the instruments. The essence lay in reflection, of light upon glass, of men upon themselves. Grieve sought to show another face, but the reflection betrayed him. Barclay sought to conceal his fraud, but conscience at last reflected the truth back upon him. Penbury saw only the reflection of his grievance, never his own folly. Even the gardener, honest, blameless, saw what was placed before him, and swore to it. Each man's fate was written in what he chose to see or to deny. I remarked that it was curious justice indeed, that a pane of glass should prove both the mask and the revealer. Curious, yes, Holmes replied, a faint gleam in his eye, but not accidental. The world, Watson, is full of such surfaces, newspapers that reflect public opinion, ledgers that reflect fortunes, eyes that reflect secrets. A detective's task is not to take the reflection for truth, but to ask what stands behind it. That is all I have done here. He rose restless and crossed to the mantel where the bronze figure of Neptune still stood, borrowed from Montague Street as evidence. He turned it in his hand, the trident catching the light. A servant's weapon, a master's silence, a merchant's grievance, each played its part. Yet in the end it was not strength nor cleverness that brought the truth, but a gardener's honest glance and a pane of polished glass. Holmes set the bronze down with finality. And so the matter closes. The law has claimed its man, the widow's their due, and the world moves on. But let us not forget, Watson, every crime is but a distortion of truth, and every distortion leaves behind some trace, however faint. The trick is to know where to look for it. He turned then, his manner already lightening, as if he had dropped the burden of Montague Street with those words. Now I hear that Mrs. Hudson has acquired a new jar of Turkish preserves. If you would be so good as to fetch a spoon, we may reward ourselves for our labours. For though truth may be bitter, Watson, it is always improved by a touch of sweetness. And so ended the case of the window that reflected another man, a story not of ghosts nor strangers, but of the reflections men fashioned for themselves, and of Holmes who with unerring vision saw past them all to the truth.